The neurologist's words echoed through the ICU. The damage is permanent. She'll never wake up. For 17 days, the young woman lay motionless, her brain scan showing catastrophic injury from the aneurysm. Her family had accepted the inevitable. The medical team had done everything possible. But at 2:47 a.m., Dmitry, a janitor who'd emigrated from Ukraine, noticed something the doctors had missed. What he saw in that darkened room defied every protocol, every regulation. What he did next took exactly 11 seconds. By morning, the impossible had happened. The patient was awake, alert, and talking, and the hospital was desperately trying to decide, was Dmitry a hero or a liability they needed to eliminate? The conference room had fallen silent just seconds before Lucia Morales hit the floor. 23 minutes into her thesis defense, mid-sentence about neuroplasticity and trauma recovery, her words had simply stopped. Her mouth opened as if to continue, but nothing came. Then her legs buckled and she collapsed forward, her head striking the edge of the presentation podium before anyone could react. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes. By then, Lucia's eyes had rolled back and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. The paramedics worked quickly, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they stabilized her neck and lifted her onto the gurney. Her mother, Elena, received the call at 3:47 in the afternoon. "Your daughter has been transported to Memorial Hospital. Please come immediately." The emergency room was a blur of movement and noise. Doctors shouted orders over the mechanical beeping of monitors. Nurses rushed past with equipment Elena couldn't name. And somewhere in the center of it all lay her daughter, surrounded by people in blue scrubs who were fighting to keep her alive. Dr. Victoria Ashford arrived within 20 minutes of the CT scan results. She'd been a neurosurgeon for 15 years and department head for the last 3. She had seen hundreds of brain injuries, delivered countless difficult prognoses to devastated families. But that didn't make this part any easier. She found Elena and Matteo in the small consultation room off the main corridor, their faces pale with fear and confusion. Dr. Ashford sat down across from them and folded her hands on the table. She spoke clearly and calmly, the way she'd been trained to deliver bad news. Lucia had suffered a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. A blood vessel in her brain had burst without warning, flooding the surrounding tissue with blood. The bleeding had caused severe damage to her frontal and temporal lobes. These were the areas responsible for personality, decision-making, memory, and language. Even if Lucia survived the emergency surgery, Dr. Ashford explained, the cognitive impairment would be profound. Elena heard the words but couldn't quite make them fit together into meaning. Matteo gripped his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Dr. Ashford gave them a moment, then continued. The surgery would attempt to stop the bleeding and relieve the pressure building inside Lucia's skull. But they needed to understand the reality. The damage was already extensive. The best-case scenario was survival with significant disability. The worst case was that Lucia might never wake up at all. They signed the consent forms with shaking hands. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 32 minutes. Dr. Ashford emerged exhausted but cautiously hopeful. Lucia had survived, the bleeding was stopped, but now came the waiting. The days that followed blurred together into an endless vigil. Lucia lay motionless in the ICU, her head wrapped in bandages, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped and hummed through the long hours. Elena kept a constant watch from the chair beside the bed, reading aloud from books Lucia had loved as a child. Matteo brought a small speaker and played their father's old jazz records at low volume, hoping some familiar sound might reach through the darkness. But Lucia didn't stir. Her eyes remained closed. The machines tracked her vital signs with cold precision, showing a body that breathed and a heart that beat, but no sign of the person who had inhabited that body just days before. Dr. Ashford ordered additional brain scans on day 3, day 7, and day 12. Each one showed the same devastating picture: extensive damage, severe swelling that refused to subside. She consulted with Dr. Jerome Patterson, the hospital's lead neurologist, and Dr. Kwan, who specialized in critical care. They stood together in the radiology suite, studying the images on the illuminated screens, and reached the same grim conclusion. The Glasgow Coma Scale measured consciousness on a scale of 3 to 15. 3 was the lowest possible score, indicating deep unconsciousness with no response to any stimulus. Lucia scored a 3. For 17 consecutive days, she scored a 3. On day 16, the hospital ethics committee gently suggested it might be time to consider withdrawing life support. Elena refused to even discuss it. Matteo backed her completely, but Dr. Ashford could see the toll the waiting was taking on them both. Elena had aged years in just over 2 weeks. Matteo had stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends. They were trapped in this liminal space between hope and grief, unable to move forward in either direction. The ICU quieted down considerably after midnight. The bustle of day shift nurses and visiting doctors gave way to a skeleton crew that moved through the dimmed hallways with soft footsteps and lowered voices. This was when Dmitry Volkov began his rounds. He had worked the night shift at Memorial Hospital for 8 years, 52 weeks a year, 4 nights a week, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. He pushed his cleaning cart from room to room with methodical efficiency, mopping floors and emptying trash bins, and sanitizing surfaces. Most people barely noticed him. He was part of the background, as invisible as the walls. But Dmitry noticed everything. Old habits died hard, and Dmitry had very old habits indeed. Before he had emigrated from Ukraine in 2014, before the language barriers and the credential recognition problems and the expired visa had trapped him in this job he was overqualified for, Dmitry had been a paramedic in Kiev. He had worked emergency medicine for 18 years. He had seen trauma and crisis in forms most people couldn't imagine. And even now, even while pushing a mop bucket down sterile hallways, that part of him remained alert and observant. He always paused when cleaning the ICU rooms, just for a moment, just long enough to glance at the monitors, to observe the patients, to satisfy that deep-seated need to know if someone needed help. The nurses had grown accustomed to this quirk. Some found it endearing, others found it mildly annoying. None of them thought much about it either way. Dmitry first noticed Lucia Morales on day 15. There was nothing particularly unusual about her case at first glance. Another coma patient, another family keeping vigil, another tragedy playing out in slow motion. But something about her monitor readings caught his attention. He couldn't say exactly what, just a feeling, a sense of wrongness he couldn't quite articulate. He came back the next night and watched more carefully. Then, the night after that. It was 2:30 in the morning on day 17 when Dmitry entered Lucia's room with his mop and cleaning supplies. Elena was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, a book open in her lap. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator and the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Dmitry began mopping in the corner farthest from the bed, working his way slowly across the room, but his eyes kept drifting to Lucia's face, to her closed eyelids. And that's when he saw it. A tiny flicker of movement beneath the lids, rapid eye movement, REM sleep, the kind of brain activity that wasn't supposed to be happening in someone with a Glasgow Coma Scale score of 3. He stopped mopping and moved closer to the bed. His heart had begun to beat faster. He looked at the monitors arrayed above her head, heart rate steady, blood oxygen saturation normal, intracranial pressure elevated at 32 millimeters of mercury, higher than it should be, but not critically so. Or was it? Dmitry glanced at Elena to make sure she was still asleep, then pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the digital records he shouldn't have had access to but had learned to access anyway. He pulled up Lucia's intracranial pressure readings for the past week. And there it was. The pattern he had sensed but hadn't been able to see clearly until now. Her pressure spiked when the bed was elevated, every single time. The standard protocol for brain injury patients was to keep the head elevated at 30 degrees to promote drainage and reduce swelling. But in Lucia's case, that elevation was doing the opposite. The pressure in her skull was building when her head was raised, not decreasing. Dmitry's mind raced back through decades of experience. He remembered a case from Kiev years ago. A young woman, similar presentation, doctors ready to give up. His supervising physician had tried something unconventional, something that went against standard protocol. He had repositioned the patient completely flat, turned her head at a specific angle. Within hours, the pressure had dropped. Within days, she had woken up. Could it be the same? Was Lucia's aneurysm location creating a blockage that standard positioning was making worse instead of better? He looked at her motionless face, at the tubes breathing for her, at the machines keeping her alive. He looked at Elena sleeping in the chair, exhausted from weeks of helpless watching. The weight of what he was considering pressed down on him. He was a janitor, a former paramedic whose credentials meant nothing in this country, who was working on an expired visa, who could be deported at any moment if anyone looked too closely at his employment records. If he was wrong, if he touched this patient and something went wrong, his life was over. And possibly hers too. But if he was right, if his decades of experience had shown him something the doctors had missed, if there was even a chance. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. Dmitri looked at Lucia. He looked at Elena. He looked at his own weathered hands, hands that had saved lives before, hands that now pushed mops and emptied trash cans. He couldn't stay silent. He wouldn't. Dmitri stepped into the hallway. The night nurse's station was empty. Bathroom break. He had maybe 3 minutes. His hands trembled as he moved back to Lucia's bedside. What he was about to do could save her life or end his. Dmitri's heart hammered against his ribs as he re-entered the room. His mouth had gone dry. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to let the doctors handle this. But his feet kept moving forward until he stood beside Lucia's bed. The bed controls were on the right side rail. Simple buttons that he had watched nurses use 1,000 times. His finger hovered over the button that would lower the head of the bed. In Kyiv, we had a case. Brain herniation, positioning was everything. The words of his old supervisor echoed across the years. Sometimes the standard protocol isn't standard for everyone. Dmitri pressed the button. The bed began to descend with a soft mechanical whir that sounded deafening in the quiet room. He watched Elena, but she didn't stir. 30 degrees became 20, then 10, then flat, completely horizontal. But that wasn't enough. The drainage pathway needed to be clear. Dmitri reached out and gently cradled Lucia's head in his hands. His palms were sweating. He turned her head slowly to the right, counting the degrees in his mind. 22 degrees. He tucked her chin down slightly, just enough to align the vertebrae, to open the channels where cerebrospinal fluid could flow. 11 seconds. That's how long it took from the moment he touched the bed controls to the moment he stepped back. 11 seconds to either save a life or destroy two. He quickly adjusted the pillows to make the new position look deliberate, like a nurse had repositioned her for comfort. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly knocked over the water pitcher on the bedside table. He caught it just in time, set it down carefully, and backed toward his cleaning cart. The hallway was still empty when he emerged. He grabbed his supplies and moved as quickly as he dared toward the janitor's closet at the end of the corridor. Once inside, he left the door open just a crack, just enough to see down the hallway toward Lucia's room. His legs felt weak. He sat down on an overturned bucket and tried to steady his breathing. The minutes crawled past. 2:51. 2:55. 3. Nothing. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe his memories had betrayed him. Maybe he had just made everything worse. At 3:03, an alarm sounded. Not the sharp, urgent scream of a code blue, but the steady, insistent beeping of a monitor detecting change. Dmitri's stomach clenched. Through the crack in the door, he saw Kelly Brennan, the night nurse, emerge from the break room and hurry toward Lucia's room. She disappeared inside. Dmitri could hear her voice, muffled but clearly confused. She was talking to herself, or maybe to the patient, saying something about the readings not making sense. Then she picked up the phone. Dr. Patel, the overnight resident, arrived within minutes. Dmitri heard his footsteps running down the corridor. More voices from inside the room. The words were indistinct, but the tone was urgent and bewildered. This doesn't make sense. What changed? That was Dr. Patel's voice, loud enough to carry into the hallway. We need to check the equipment. But wait. Look at her pupils. Dmitri pressed his hand against his chest. His heart was racing. He should leave. He should finish his shift and go home and pretend this never happened. But he couldn't move. He had to know. More medical staff arrived as the early morning shift began to trickle in. Dmitri watched them hurry past his hiding spot. He heard fragments of conversation, pressure dropping, from 35 down to 18. In less than 15 minutes, pupils responsive. First time since admission. Elena's cry cut through the clinical chatter, a sound of pure shock and hope mixed together. Dmitri closed his eyes and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. At 6:20, Dr. Ashford arrived for her morning rounds. Dmitri had moved his cleaning cart to a different floor by then, but word spread through the hospital staff like wildfire. The impossible patient, the miracle in room 412. He heard it from other janitors, from nurses grabbing coffee, from orderlies passing in the halls. Lucia Morales was awake, not just awake, tracking movement, following voices, squeezing hands on command, trying to speak. After 17 days of nothing, after brain scans that showed catastrophic damage, after a Glasgow coma scale score that indicated no hope, she was waking up. Dr. Ashford ran every neurological test she could think of. Her hands were shaking as she held the penlight to check Lucia's pupils. "Squeeze my fingers. Can you do that for me?" And Lucia did. Weak, trembling, but unmistakable. "Wiggle your toes." And she did. The medical team that flooded into the room stood in stunned silence. This is impossible. Yesterday, she was effectively brain dead. Elena was crying and laughing at the same time, holding Lucia's hand and calling for Matteo. Her brother arrived within the hour, sprinting through the hospital corridors. The family embraced around the bed, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes, but desperate to connect with the person they thought they'd lost. It's a miracle. That's what everyone kept saying. A miracle. But Bernard Walsh, the hospital administrator, didn't believe in miracles. He believed in liability and lawsuits and reputation management. At 8 o'clock that morning, he convened an emergency meeting in the third-floor conference room. Dr. Ashford was there. So were Dr. Patterson and Dr. Kwan. So was the hospital's lead attorney and the head of risk management. Walsh wanted answers. What changed in the treatment protocol? Who authorized a change? The overnight records were pulled and reviewed line by line. Nothing. No medication adjustments, no procedures, no documented interventions of any kind. But something had happened. Something had fundamentally altered the course of this patient's recovery. The head of security was called in. Pull the footage. Room 412, between midnight and 6 a.m. They fast-forwarded through hours of stillness. Elena sleeping, machines beeping, nurses doing their rounds. And then, at 2:47, a figure entering the room, pushing a cleaning cart, staying for several minutes, moving close to the bed. The angle wasn't perfect, but the motion was clear. He was doing something to the bed controls, doing something to the patient. We need to know exactly what happened in that room. Dr. Ashford's voice was tight. Walsh was already 3 steps ahead. Find out who that is. Get his employee file. I want him in my office within the hour. But when they called down to custodial services, they were told Dmitri Volkov had clocked out at 6 a.m. Same as always. They had his address. They left messages. He didn't answer. By noon, the full security footage had been reviewed frame by frame. Dr. Patterson watched it 3 times. He repositioned her. Completely flat. That's absolutely contraindicated for brain injury patients. Standard protocol is 30-degree elevation to reduce intracranial pressure. Putting her flat should have made things worse, not better. But she's awake. Dr. Ashford said it quietly, almost to herself. Whatever he did, it worked. Walsh's face was red. Worked? He's a janitor who violated every medical protocol we have. If she had died, do you understand the negligence lawsuit we'd be facing? We need to find him. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a public relations nightmare. Too late. The media had already picked up the story. Miracle recovery at Memorial Hospital. Local news vans were setting up in the parking lot. Reporters were calling the hospital's press office. Social media was lighting up with speculation and celebration. The family was being contacted for interviews. And somewhere in all that chaos, someone asked the question, how did this happen? What changed? Elena, still wiping tears from her face, mentioned that the night janitor had been in the room. Sweet older man. Always so gentle. And suddenly the narrative shifted. A janitor? An unauthorized person touched a comatose patient? The legal implications began to crystallize in real time. Walsh made the decision. Report Dmitri to the authorities. Protect the hospital. Frame it as an unfortunate incident that could have ended in tragedy. Distance the institution from the unauthorized intervention. But Elena wasn't having it. When a nurse quietly mentioned that the hospital was investigating the janitor, Elena's response was immediate and fierce. "I don't care if he's the Pope or the janitor. I want to thank whoever gave me my daughter back." Matteo started asking questions. Who was working last night? What's his name? Where can I find him? He talked to nurses. He talked to other custodial staff. He pieced together a picture of Dmitry Volkov, 62 years old, 8 years at Memorial, quiet, kind, always paid attention to the patients, born in Ukraine and possibly working on an expired visa. Dr. Ashford went home that afternoon feeling like she was being torn in. 2. Medical protocol was clear. What Dmitry had done was dangerous and unauthorized, but the results were undeniable. Lucia was awake. The positioning had relieved the pressure. Somehow this janitor had seen something she and her entire medical team had missed. Dmitry sat in his small apartment watching the news coverage on his old television. His hands hadn't stopped shaking since he'd gotten home. His phone kept ringing with calls from the hospital. He didn't answer. He knew what was coming. He had known the moment he touched that bed. This was the end of everything: his job, his life in this country, possibly his freedom. He started packing a bag, not much, clothes, documents, the photograph of his sister and her children back in Kyiv. Where would he go? He had no idea, but he couldn't stay here. By 3 p.m., hospital security had his address. By 4 p.m., someone in the administration had made a call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Unauthorized worker, possible identity, issues, needs investigation. The wheels of bureaucracy began to turn. By 5 p.m., Dr. Ashford was standing alone in the hospital parking garage. She had stayed late, unable to face going home, unable to stop thinking about what had happened. She had traced Dmitry's license plate through hospital records. She had his phone number pulled up on her screen. One call. That's all it would take. She could warn him, give him time to run, but that would make her complicit. That would put her career, her reputation, everything she had built over 15 years at risk. Or she could stay silent. Let the system handle it. Dmitry had broken the rules. He had touched a patient without authorization. The fact that it had worked didn't change the violation. Did it? Her finger hovered over the call button. The parking garage was cold and empty. Her breath made small clouds in the winter air. Somewhere above her in the ICU, Lucia Morales was awake and talking to her mother. Alive because a janitor had refused to stay silent. Dr. Ashford had a choice: make the call that would destroy him or destroy her career by staying silent. The phone felt heavy in her hand. She closed her eyes and tried to remember why she had become a doctor in the first place: to help people, to save lives, to never give up on a patient. She pressed the button. Dr. Ashford drove across the city in silence. The address she had pulled from hospital records led her to a modest apartment building in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the sidewalks needed repair. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, engine off, staring at the entrance. She had told herself she was going to call him, warn him, give him a chance to disappear before ICE showed up at his door. But now that she was here, something else pulled her forward. She needed to understand. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. No elevator. She climbed the stairs and knocked on door 3C. The sound echoed in the empty hallway. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. Then she heard footsteps. The door opened. Dmitry looked older than she remembered, tired, but his eyes were clear and steady. He looked at her white coat, at her hospital ID badge still clipped to her pocket, and nodded slowly. "I am ready to face consequences." She had rehearsed what she would say on the drive over, questions about protocol and liability and risk, but standing there in his doorway, those words felt hollow. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. The apartment was small and spare. A kitchen barely big enough for one person, a living room with a single couch and a television playing the news on mute, medical textbooks in Russian stacked on a shelf beside the window, a photograph of a woman and 2 children tucked into the frame of a mirror. They sat across from each other. Dr. Ashford folded her hands in her lap and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since morning. "How did you know?" Dmitri was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak. His English was accented but precise. He told her about Kiev, about 18 years working as a paramedic in a city that had shaped him into someone who could see patterns in chaos, about a case in 2006, a young woman who had presented almost exactly like Lucia. Aneurysm, coma, elevated intracranial pressure that wouldn't respond to treatment. The doctors had been ready to give up, but his supervising physician had been stubborn. Old school, trained in an era when they didn't have all the fancy imaging technology, when they had to rely on observation and instinct. He had looked at the pressure readings and made a guess. What if the standard positioning was wrong for this particular case? What if the anatomy was unusual enough that elevation was trapping fluid instead of draining it? They had repositioned the patient. Flat, head turned, within hours the pressure had dropped. Within a week, she had woken up. Dmitri had never forgotten. He emigrated in 2014 when Crimea fell and the world he knew began to crumble. He thought he could continue his medical career here. But the credential transfers were complicated. The language barrier was worse than he expected. The licensing exams were expensive, and he was sending every spare dollar back to his sister and her children. His visa expired in 2019. He meant to renew it. Then the pandemic hit and everything shut down, and somehow 5 years passed and he was still here, still cleaning floors, still watching patients and seeing things that his training wouldn't let him ignore. Dr. Ashford listened. When he finished, she asked the question she needed answered. How did you know it would work? I didn't know. His voice was steady, but I recognized the pattern. Her pressure readings, they were positional. Every time the bed was elevated, the numbers went up. The fluid had nowhere to drain. Her anatomy, the location of the rupture, it created a blockage that the standard position made worse. He leaned forward. I'm not saying I am smarter than you. I am not saying your protocols are wrong. I am saying I saw something in that moment that the protocols did not cover. Sometimes the textbook answer is not the answer for every patient. Dr. Ashford felt something shift inside her chest. We followed protocol perfectly. But protocol didn't account for her specific anatomy. She said it out loud, testing the words. Medical education sometimes becomes medical dogma. Dmitri nodded. In emergency medicine, we used to say that protocols save lives until they don't. You must know when to follow them and when to trust what you see. They talked for 2 more hours about medicine and certainty and the space between doing everything right and doing the right thing. When Dr. Ashford finally left, she didn't make the warning call she had planned. She drove home in silence, her mind racing with possibilities she wasn't ready to name yet. By morning, word had spread through the hospital. Dr. Ashford had been seen at the janitor's apartment. The timing looked suspicious. The implications were troubling. Bernard Walsh convened an emergency board meeting at 8 a.m. sharp. The conference room was packed with administrators, legal counsel, and senior medical staff. Walsh laid it out plainly. We have a PR nightmare and potential lawsuit waiting to happen. The legal team had prepared their position, distance the hospital from Dmitri, frame his actions as unauthorized and dangerous. The narrative they wanted to push was simple. Patient recovered despite janitor's interference, not because of it. They had already drafted a statement suggesting natural recovery, coincidental timing, the resilience of the human body. Dr. Patterson spoke up from the back of the room. Victoria, you know that's not true. I've reviewed the imaging. The pressure relief was immediate and directly correlated to the positioning change. There's no other explanation. The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Dr. Ashford. Walsh's expression was stone. We need institutional unity on this. The hospital's reputation is at stake. Dr. Ashford felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on her. Her career, her position, everything she had worked for balanced against what she knew to be true. She opened her mouth to respond, but Walsh cut her off. The decision has been made. Dmitri Volkov will be terminated effective immediately and reported to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. His work visa status will be thoroughly investigated. The meeting ended. Dr. Ashford walked out feeling like the walls were closing in. By noon, the media narrative had shifted. Hospital investigates unauthorized intervention, questions about safety protocols and liability. The miracle story was becoming a cautionary tale about untrained personnel making dangerous decisions. Walsh called Dr. Ashford into his office that afternoon. The ultimatum was clear. She would make a public statement. Dimitri's actions were dangerous and unnecessary. The patient's recovery was unrelated to his intervention. If she refused, she would be suspended pending investigation of her own judgment in the case. Elena and Matteo learned the truth that same day. A reporter told them. The janitor, who had been in Lucia's room, was facing deportation. He had touched their daughter without authorization. The hospital was investigating. Elena's response was immediate. He saved her. How can they do this? But Walsh had anticipated the family's reaction. He met with them privately. If you publicly support him, we'll be forced to claim that Lucia's recovery was natural and that he endangered her. We'll make sure his name is destroyed. Think about your daughter's care. Think about her future treatment here. You need this hospital. It was a threat wrapped in concern. Elena and Matteo left the meeting shaken and silent. On day 20, Lucia was conscious enough to understand what was happening. Her speech was still slurred and halting. Her movements were weak, but her mind was clearing more each day. Matteo told her about Dimitri, about what he had done, about what was happening to him now. Lucia's response came slowly, but with absolute determination. He saved me. I remember. The medical team exchanged glances. Elena leaned forward. What do you remember, sweetheart? Lucia's words came in fragments, feeling trapped, hearing voices but unable to respond, the sensation of pressure, constant and crushing. And then, at some point she couldn't name, the feeling of that pressure releasing, like something that had been stuck suddenly flowing free. She remembered. Dr. Ashford was called in immediately. What Lucia was describing suggested locked-in elements, partial consciousness that no one had detected. It was rare but documented. Patients who appeared completely unresponsive but retained some level of awareness. The implications were staggering. Lucia's testimony could validate everything Dimitri had done, but it also raised terrible questions about what she had experienced during those 17 days. On day 21, just after dawn, ICE agents arrived at Dimitri's apartment. He had been expecting them. He didn't resist. They took him to a detention facility 30 miles outside the city. The deportation proceedings began immediately. Visa expired over 5 years ago, working illegally, clear violation of immigration law. His court-appointed attorney tried to argue humanitarian grounds. He saved a woman's life. But the immigration judge was unmoved. Medical expertise doesn't grant exemption from immigration law. Thousands of qualified people wait years to come here legally. Why should he be treated differently? Dr. Ashford learned about the detention that afternoon. She felt sick. Her silence, her hesitation, her fear of institutional pressure had contributed to this. She had known this was coming, and she had done nothing to stop it. Elena and Matteo sat by Lucia's bedside that evening. We have to do something, but what? They had no money for lawyers, no political connections, no leverage against a hospital that held their daughter's care in its hands. Lucia's voice was stronger than it had been that morning. Tell my story. In the detention center, Dimitri was allowed one phone call. He called his sister in Kyiv. The conversation was short and painful. He apologized. He couldn't send money anymore. He might be coming home soon, but not the way he had hoped. She cried. He told her it would be okay. He wasn't sure he believed it. Dr. Ashford sat alone in her home office that night, staring at the framed diplomas on her wall. Medical school, residency, fellowship, board certifications, awards for excellence, 15 years of achievement. She thought about Dimitri mopping floors with medical textbooks on his shelf, about expertise that had been dismissed because it came from the wrong person in the wrong position. The hospital staff was divided. Some supported Dimitri quietly in break rooms and parking lots. Others feared association with someone who had violated protocol, who threatened the institutional authority they relied on. The safer choice was always to side with the institution. The news cycle was already moving on. The miracle story had become an immigration controversy. Another tired debate about borders and rules and who deserved to be where. The human details were getting lost in the noise, and Dmitri had 72 hours before deportation became final. Dr. Ashford sat in her office at midnight. Lucia's brain scans were illuminated on 3 monitors in front of her. 17 days of irreversible damage. One janitor's 11-second intervention. A young woman now reading, talking, living. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. There was one call she could make, one person whose voice carried enough weight to change everything, but making it would mean admitting she'd been wrong, challenging her own hospital, possibly ending the career she'd spent 20 years building. Her finger hovered over the name. She had been taught to trust protocols, to rely on institutional authority, to protect herself first. But protocols hadn't saved Lucia, and institutional authority was about to destroy the person who had. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, "This is the New England Journal of Medicine. How can I help you?" Dr. Ashford took a deep breath. "My name is Dr. Victoria Ashford. I'm a neurosurgeon at Memorial Hospital, and I need to report a case that challenges everything we think we know about brain injury protocols."